let's just take another look at this. It's been a little over about a year since Nancy Pelosi has been, again, the Speaker of the House. And since then, it was the shutdown at the time. She has been a thorn in the president's side. Now she is seeming to have achieved some level of success in getting Mitch McConnell, who 2 weeks ago said on Fox News, no witnesses. I mean, hand in glove with the White House on this.
We always question Nancy Pelosi's strategy until it's proven that it's the correct strategy at the end. And in hindsight, we're like, wow, she really knew what she was doing. And I wonder if we could just stop criticizing her in the beginning and wait. Because often there is a reason for the tactics she's using. I think this was a strategic pause to allow there to be oxygen on the fact that Mitch McConnell is covering up for the White House. There's additional pieces of information and evidence that have been revealed post voting on the articles themselves. That's a big deal. And I think that Nancy Pelosi understood that either the president and the White House would continue to, do things that were wrong and potentially impeachable. They could always have new articles of impeachment and impeach him again. And so I think that she's just trying to have all her options on the table instead of just kowtowing to Mitch McConnell. He's always been seen, and, all the analysts say he's the tactician, he's the strategist. Well, now he's maybe met his match.
It's kind of interesting, Rick, because that is what people say, right? This is a guy who counts votes as well as Nancy Pelosi does and gets things done, or in the case of the last few years in Congress, gets nothing done. But in this particular case, I remember watching that night that he was on Fox saying that he's hand in glove with the president, thinking to myself, that doesn't seem very strategic of Mitch McConnell. It looks like the White House and the Republicans may have just shown their hand here.
Mitch McConnell is an extraordinarily gifted strategist when it comes to the ordinary legislative business of the Senate. In fact, the ordinary legislative business of the Senate, he's probably the best since LBJ and maybe even better. But we are in an extraordinary moment right now where he understands very well that he's got 5 or 6 senators out there right now who are vulnerable in 2020, who are in purple or blue states, who are in danger by the fact that the majority of Americans in those states believe that there should be an impeachment trial with witnesses in the Senate, who believe that Trump has done something wrong, who believe that Trump needs to be, held to account, and that the Senate process shouldn't be shortcutted and waved away by Mitch McConnell. He has that knowledge. He's been he's at a very difficult position trying to balance, dealing with Donald Trump on the one hand and dealing with the political realities on the other. The minute Mitch McConnell senses that his majority is in danger is when he will start rolling back on some of these things.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.